We have with us John Walsh, the godfather of pump therapy. And he'll sing for us too.
You don't want that.
Well, John has, he knows more about pump therapy than anybody I've ever met. He's also had diabetes for just over 60 years. He's doing pretty good for 60 years. Okay?
Yeah, it's the preservatives.
John's the author of the Pumping Insulin books, and he's done quite a bit of research looking at pump data. He consults multiple companies on pump therapy. In his spare time, he and his wife Ruth run the Diabetes Mall, Diabetes Net. He's a practicing physician's assistant and currently doing some work on artificial pancreas technology. So we're lucky to have John with us. I think we're going to hear some very useful and interesting information about what's the latest in pump therapy and what we could be looking forward to. So I'll turn over to John. Great.
Thanks, Gary. It's nice to have Gary and Cliff covering my material before I get there. So we'll just be reviewing a little bit of new material. So yeah, we'll get into this. If you have questions, I like open door policy, so if you have any questions at any point, just raise your hand or speak right up. So we'll kind of go over kind of a little bit of brief stuff about the advantages of pumping. How many here are thinking about a pump or have a child thinking about a pump? Okay. So most of us are already converted. So I'll do a little bit of talk about line and patch pumps, about tuning the bolus calculator, infusion set issues, and what's on the horizon. When we're trying to control the blood sugars, it's difficult to bring the blood sugars down. And what we found over the years is that as you want to come down, you have to use better technology. That's about the only way to do it, to get all the data you need. Every once in a while I have a patient who does really well on injections, and when that happens, I don't change a thing. They're fine. But that's not the case for most people with type 1 diabetes. Right up here. Okay. I've got to brush my teeth with this microphone, Gary says. So, okay. So to get there, there's easy ways to do it. I personally like using Dr. Edelman's vehicle here rather than the 18-wheeler. When you can turn insulin very quickly, or more quickly, insulin's still relatively slow, but when you can do it faster, that's a huge advantage in sports and in just generally in life with diabetes. There are a lot of things that affect the blood sugars. We all know that. When you got the current glucose and what direction it's headed, the bolus on board, how many carbs are on board at the start of an exercise, what the length and intensity of the exercise is. That's the major controller for both your carb intake and your insulin reduction. The training and glycogen level have an impact. Any recent lows. If you've had a recent low, there's a greater risk for another low for about 36 hours. And so it can make a big difference in what happens during an exercise event. Whether you're doing aerobic or anaerobic or maybe a mix of them, and what the competition level is. Cliff kind of has covered some of the impacts that competition has, and I'll reinforce that. Pumps add a lot because they give you convenience. You can give a dose anytime. You can change basal rates, use temp basal reductions or increases. The you generally get by with less insulin on a pump, and you get better impact out of it. Over the long run, that may be a huge advantage for type 1 diabetes as well. The blood sugar variability is usually reduced on a pump. That's been shown in several studies. And the A1C drop has been shown in some studies, but it's not as great a drop as I think we ought to be getting out of pumps. And I think a lot of that is because most pumps are not yet set up well. We've got a lot of work to do on kind of fine-tuning insulin doses to individuals. There's a lot more social freedom. You know, like a kid going off to college has a lot more ability to flex their lifestyle and eat when they want to and on the spur of the moment than they do with injections. And one of the things I like in the clinic is I get a lot better data out of pumps than I do from people on MDI. You can see exactly what's going on. You can obviously tell that some people really do well on pumps and CGMs. The Team Type 1 did a 3,000-mile ride. I haven't ever gone quite that far, but it's a huge ride, and they did it in a little over 5 days. They set the team type, the group team record in 2009, and they placed first and second in previous years. So they're you can really do quite well when you're on a pump. A lot of other sports and biking athletes in particular are starting to look at diabetes technology for an advantage. If you think about it, if you wear a CGM during a race, if you're doing a marathon or a 100-miler, you know when you're starting to bonk. So there's a huge advantage. In a team trial, each rider knew whether they were ready to go out for the next tour, and if the glucose was off or they had too low a blood sugar, somebody else could take their place. So and a lot of athletes are also getting into using insulin to restore glycogen quickly. So the tremendous number of line pumps out there. The Accu-Check Combo is a real reliable pump. Uses a little different bolus calculator than most pumps, but it's very good delivery. Has a nice remote on it. The Medtronic Revel has been around a long time. It's got the CGM in the pump. The Asante Snap has a preloaded, you can put in a 3 mil pen cartridge and get very fast loading. It's got some nice features. It handles it subtracts bolus on board from carb counts, much like the Cosmo pump did. A lot of people like the Cosmo pump because it gave very accurate bolus doses. And the Asante Snap has that capability. They may also put the super bolus in. I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. The Animas Ping is a great pump. The Animas and Tandem are both working with Dexcom to get the Dexcom readings integrated into the pump. And that's a huge advantage because the pump can show the CGM tracing, and a spouse or parent or child can have an extra sensor readout and just track the blood sugar as well. So, and the Tandem T-Slim is a terrific pump. It's a totally different mechanism. it's a pressure pumping mechanism, and it has a micro delivery system in it that can deliver thousandths of a unit. So it's extremely precise. It has a little bit of an advantage for travelers because in a standard pump, you've got the cartridge sitting in the pump, and when you take off in a plane for altitude, the pressure drop lets insulin be delivered, and you can deliver, you know, up to about 1.5 units if you have a full reservoir. When you come down to land, you can't suck that insulin back. So if anybody had low blood sugars when they landed in San Diego, you can think about this mechanism. So the gated mechanism in the tandem makes it much less likely for that to happen. Patch pumps, how many people are on Omnipod? Okay, yeah. The patch pumps are real convenient because you get rid of the infusion line. I'm not a big fan personally of the patch pump because I tend to lose the controller. If I can't fit it in my pocket, it's not going with me. But a lot of people handle that very well. They're organized, and they get very good benefits out of it. There are modular patch pumps coming in that look good. The Accu-Chek Solo is probably going to be released relatively soon. It's a 3-part system. There's a base that goes on the skin. There's the brains of the operation, which is recycled, and then there's a reservoir. So it makes the cost of the pump come down, and you can reuse parts of it that you know, make it quite interesting. Medtronic has a similar pump. I'm not sure if they're going to push it forward. I don't know. Have we got any Medtronic folks here? But the Solo pump and the Medtronic patch pump are both modular, have very similar components. So it'll be real interesting to see how those play out. The Valeritas Vigo is a little more for type 2, so I won't cover it today, but I will talk about the Calibra. So the Solo is holds 200 units. It does have an auto inserter, weighs only 1 ounce. The bolus button is on the pump, so if you walk off without the controller, you can't test your blood sugar, but you can bolus for meals. So for convenience and for people who sometimes may not remember to take the pod with them, this is a great deal. So there's a European pump company that I'll mention. This is a British company, and it's called a Cellnovo. They have a wax motor in the pump, and I thought that was rather peculiar. And I haven't heard any specifics about how well a wax motor is going to work in Arizona or in Alaska. There are kind of inherent problems with it. What happened is it's this very small cube, and there's a heating element in it, so it expands the wax. It pushes about 0.3 of a unit into the line, and then it cools down, and then it reheats, cools down. So the delivery of boluses is probably fairly slow. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. The company has a terrific internet, a cloud-based system. The software, the blood sugars are sent up to the cloud and can be sent to a parent or to a spouse, to a physician. It's a very nice system in terms of the software. The WTech Joule is a little different system. This one uses MEMS technology, microencapsulated silicon-based system. The motor is just tiny. It is minuscule. It's made out of silicon, and the fabrication, you can make you know, 1,000 of these on a regular circuit board type setup. So should be a relatively low cost system and deliver very precise doses. So it looks interesting. I don't know how the cost of this will work out over time. It's been approved in Europe for some time, but I don't think they're shipping yet. And it's been quite a bit of time, so I'm not sure where they're going with this pump. But the thinking behind it is quite interesting. Another nice new innovation is the Calibra. This is a J&J. J&J bought this recently, and it's basically a slap-on patch pump that's bolus only. So for some people who are on MDI, this may be an option for getting bolus doses. You can give a half unit, 1 unit, 2 unit, or 5 unit, depending on what your needs are. So you know, a lot of innovation going on in the pump world. There's a lot of controllers for pumps that make them interesting. A lot of women, and just for convenience, you may not want to pull the pump out. May want to just keep it under close and just use the remote to test the glucose and give a bolus. And on some of them, like the Accu-Check, you can change basal rates, give a temp basal, etc. So there's a lot of flexibility going on. The Omnipods had a remote for some time. Now the problem with blood sugars is they tend to go down, and there's a lot of reasons that contribute to that. Most of it is related to having too much insulin on board at the time that at the start of the exercise. And Cliff was kind of mentioning that the bolus on board is a major component of that fall in glucose. We don't think enough about the bolus on board. You know, when you're going to bed, if you got a blood sugar of 130, you don't want to just say, fine, I want to go to bed. You want to check and see how much bolus on board is left. Because at 130, you may need insulin, or you may need carbohydrate. And it's really easy to figure out if you look at how much bolus on board there is. And the same thing occurs when you're going into exercise. You want to know what that active insulin is at the time you start, because it makes a huge difference on what the carb intake that you have at the time of the exercise. With longer exercises, sometimes you know, runner, biker just won't get in enough carb intake to compensate for their energy needs, and so that can make the blood sugar drop also. And that's where a CGM makes a huge difference. And training has a huge impact. When you're not trained for an exercise, anybody know how many extra carbs you need for the exercise? Anybody, has anybody looked that up? Let's say you're not, you normally run races and you now are picking up bike riding. How much extra carbohydrate do you need because you're starting a different type of exercise?
So the amount you would need if you just started anything new. I mean, you don't have any crossover, really, do you?
Right, exactly. You know, you're using leg muscles for biking, but you know, for running, but biking is a totally different event. you need about 25% extra carbohydrate when you start training, and primarily because you're building new glycogen stores, you're enlarging glycogen stores. And when you do a new exercise, your body is smart. It says, hey, he or she may do that to me tomorrow, so I better get my body ready. So the glycogen stores enlarge, there's some new muscle development, and that drops the blood sugar. So you need more carbohydrate to build those stores. When the blood sugar goes up with exercise, it's almost always because there's too little insulin. It's been cut back too far, or the basal rate's been stopped too long or dropped too far. There's just an inadequate amount of insulin is the primary cause. But there are other things that contribute as well. You may have just overeaten to, you know, in terms of wanting to prevent a low blood sugar. If you get into anaerobic exercise or competition, you've got stress hormones raising the blood sugar. And every once in a while, dehydration might magnify the blood sugar elevation. So if you don't have enough fluid intake, the blood may thicken a bit, and it'll make the glucose appear higher than it actually is. And Bill Carlson kind of clued me into another problem, and that is just muscle trauma. When you're doing the kind of exercise that Bill does, you know, 100-mile runs, the trauma that occurs to muscle raises inflammatory particles, cytokines, and you can get insulin resistance for hours or a couple of days afterwards, and you actually need more insulin. So that in training, you're kind of getting, as you do training, you get the insulin levels reduced. So anytime you start going from a vegetative state to couch potato to you know, marathon runner, you really get the glycogen stores built up, and you get the insulin levels reduced as you get ready for the event. So the advantage of training, of doing something regularly, is that you're already prepped for that activity. It's kind of the weekend warrior and you know, the weekend gardener, whatever, that tends to get into more trouble with hypoglycemia because they haven't done that all week. So, and I like to think about glycogen as nature's glucose shock absorber. Okay. And as Cliff pointed out, one of the things that happens with the intensity as you go from a VO2 max of 25, pretty much at rest, the carb requirement is pretty low. So the carb requirement is kind of the red and green area at the top. And when you get up to about 65% VO2 max, you really are getting about 50 to maybe 70% carb intake for the exercise. And if your insulin level is a bit too high, your need for carbohydrate may be even greater than that, because you can't access the other fuel of fat. So it's both a matter of the intensity of the exercise, but also what the insulin level is at the time of the exercise. When you get up into anaerobic, you can get up to 80% carb intake, or 100% at times, and so it really ramps up the need for carbohydrate. Fortunately, anaerobic exercises don't last that long. So in kind of simple terms, the when you look at the carbohydrate requirement and what the body wants to use, when you look at intensity, as your intensity rises, you need a higher percentage of carbohydrate for fuel. Less fat is being used. As the length of the exercise increases, you have to shift from carbohydrate to fat because there's just not enough carbohydrate in the body to keep maintaining a high carb consumption. You can take carbohydrate during a long intensity exercise, but you can't. You've got to get access to those fat fuels because as Cliff says, they're the big fuel stores in the body. And so the longer something goes, the more you need those fat stores. So my typing kind of cut off here, but you know, the longer you exercise, the more intensely you exercise, and the less trained you are, the more you need to reduce your insulin doses. So it's just a real simple thing. Now, anaerobic is a bit different because the if you look at the these are stress hormone levels, norepinephrine and epinephrine, and this is about a 40-minute anaerobic, you know, near anaerobic exercise, and you can see those levels really go up. And what those do is they raise the blood sugar. So in anaerobic exercise, you are basically raising the blood sugar. When somebody does a 100-yard sprint with diabetes, their blood sugar is going to go up. And if they do the race frequently enough, they may just take some insulin, may bolus before the race. It may be the easiest way to control the blood sugar. Now, so as the VO2 kind of shifts, at a lower VO2, you use less carbohydrate. But as you begin to shift over to kind of the cut line between aerobic, which is about 70% of VO2 max, up into anaerobic, which is generally above 65, 70, 75%, you get into two different regulatory fields. At 70% or lower, insulin is the primary glucose controller. But when you get into stress events, anaerobic exercise, then epinephrine and norepinephrine, the catecholamines, begin to take over in terms of glucose control. So in terms of duration, though, anaerobic is very short, usually 10 to 15 minutes max, sometimes a little bit longer. Now, a lot of athletes use anaerobic as a preventive. Because it tends to raise the blood sugar and tends to raise stress hormone levels, if you're doing aerobic exercise for a long distance or a long time, if you put in some spurts in there, and can be as short as 10 to 30 seconds of anaerobic activity where you kind of just go all out, you can actually release enough epinephrine and norepinephrine to keep the blood sugar from dropping. So it's a bit of an advantage for long events to have that go on.
John, sorry.
Oh yeah.
I've also heard recently about some great benefit aerobically for doing like up to just like 4 30-second spurts of high intensity during your workout.
That's what I'm talking about here. Is just putting the anaerobic spurts into your aerobic exercise.
Right, but so it helps with your avoiding hypoglycemia, and it's also good aerobically, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anytime you kind of try to max out while you're training, you will release a bit more stress hormones during that time, but you get into better shape faster. So there's even, I think, some studies where they just do like 20 minutes of high intensity exercise, or even 20 seconds.
20 seconds.
Yeah.
A week or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a recent study out of England.
Yeah.
It was really amazing.
Have you started doing that at all, Steve? Have you tried it?
I've tried it a little bit, but probably not been consistent enough. But I do feel it to do real high intensity for 20 seconds, 4 times as hard as you can for 20 to 30 seconds, and then do that like 4 times in your workout. Do it 3 or 4 times a week is a lot harder than I thought it would be.
Yeah. I'm not saying it's real easy.
But I mean, you feel it. Yeah. I was amazed, thinking, oh, I can do this. It's a minute and a half of sprinting as hard as possible, and then do it, 3 or 4 days in a week. Do it, for 30 seconds. I can do that, and you're looking at that clock going. It's like, when is it going to come? And it amazed me how I just didn't feel like doing it the next day.
Yeah, yeah. There may be some glycogen rebuilding we need to do there, but it's a
That's great.
Yeah.
But I didn't think about the avoiding hypoglycemia. That's wonderful.
Yeah. And the other caution is if if you try to do this even with if you got excess insulin on board, excess insulin levels there, an anaerobic spurt may not overcome that that excess insulin. So there's always caveats in anything that you do, especially with exercise. So competition. How many here do competitive events? Where they, yeah. Does it raise the blood sugar?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It depends on the intensity level, which makes a lot of sense with what you're saying.
Yeah, and the competition. You're exactly right. The hard part about competition is you don't know when it's going to come. You may go into a race or event and just feel you're trained, you're ready to go, things are really smooth, and you're keeping up with the other top runners or whatever, and you're not getting embarrassed by your performance, and you do just wonderfully, and the stress never reaches a level where it raises the blood sugar. Competition comes in a lot of ways. A mild level or a well-handled level, you don't release that many stress hormones, and the stress hormones can actually, epinephrine can actually make you more sensitive to insulin when at lower levels. So it may actually keep your blood sugar down, or it may actually cause a low blood sugar.
Is that why I was curious? Because I've observed, like, stress from work, blood sugar goes up, but fear type of stress, I saw something that scared me, makes it drop.
Okay, so basically he's saying that stress at work tends to make his blood sugar go up, and fear tends to drop it. I think most people would find that fear raised the glucose. But I've not seen any data on that. But
my old ice hockey days.
Okay. Yeah.
If I was to get into a fight, my blood sugar would drop.
Oh, okay. Now wait.
But
Put out a lot of energy, right?
But the sprinting for 3 minutes straight on the ice caused my blood sugar always to go down.
Yeah.
Not up.
Yeah. Just the sprinting and just the competitiveness.
Which is making me wonder, where do we end up with the difference between aerobic and anaerobic? Because skating is, to me, aerobic, but when you're sprinting all out, that would be anaerobic.
Right.
But your body was used to that load at that point.
But
Yeah,
could
that's
that be
true.
also that, okay, so your blood sugar went up, so So then you gave insulin for the blood sugar going up when you really already had the active insulin. It was just that it was your adrenaline raising the blood sugar, and you know, once you were done with the adrenaline, it would drop your blood sugar anyways because of the active insulin, and now you've stacked it.
My secret was I used to chew a piece of bazooka bubble gum while playing.
Okay. Bazooka bubble gum, it works, it keeps the blood sugar normal. I love that.
Well, it does if you're burning the carbs as fast as you can.
Yeah, yeah. But this kind of raises, you know, whether hockey raises the blood sugar or lowers it depends an awful lot on how many stress hormones you put out. If you put out if you raise your epinephrine level but not high, it actually enhances performance and can actually drop the blood sugar.
Which is why I chew the gum.
Right.
Well, it's like you were saying, though, it's hard to tell when that intensity. So it's similar. My competitive events are on the basketball court, and I don't know beforehand how intense that game is going to be, and so it just, yeah, it's hard to predict.
You don't know ahead of time, and that's the problem with it. You can't predict it. Steve?
I was just going to ask about, about the stress hormones plus the anaerobic events. It seems like that's more of a temporary raise in the blood sugar, right? So when those stress hormones subside, and hours after the exercise, wouldn't you still be more sensitive later? Insulin sensitive? Insulin be more efficient?
Steve's just asking about the later hours, whether you're more sensitive because you've released stress hormones. I don't.
The exercise in general.
Yeah, I don't think the stress hormones are going to are probably not going to make you more sensitive to insulin later, but the exercise definitely can.
You know, the stress hormones will make you more insulin resistant at the time.
Right.
But that's only a temporary action. Is that been measured to how long that lasts, that temporary insulin resistance? Because I think most people are familiar with having their insulin work more efficiently in the rest of the day after a good workout. But is there data on how long that insulin resistance lasts?
No, not that I'm aware of. I don't know, is Cliff still here? Yeah. Cliff, have you seen anything on how long the release of stress hormones from competition, how long it keeps the blood sugar elevated?
It seems to be, at least this personal experience, but I think when you come down in 15, 20 minutes of that kind of activity, if you continue with aerobic exercise at a much lower intensity level, it'll flip back over pretty quick. If the valve is very short, very high intensity, and then just completely stop, it could last for longer. But I find that the body actually kind of switches over, depending on what the stimulus is, if you're doing kind of exercise. So,
But then out like 2 or 3 hours later, I guess it would still depend on the overall length of the exercise, but would you still be using insulin more efficiently for a good period?
depends on the level of, in my experience, the level of blood sugar. So, for instance, if you're doing an hour all out, and you wear down that battery, the body, if you're guessing 60 gallons, now down to 8 gallons, it's going to be a lot. If it's only 5 or 10 minutes for, you did a 2-minute burst, you work hardly anything, so you got the sense of that.
So highly individuals to work at it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the key, is just understanding that the competition is very difficult to predict. You just can't do it. If you do an event regularly and your blood sugar always goes up when you do it, you can then kind of estimate you're probably going to need some extra insulin before the start of the event. But again, it's awfully hard to predict. You know, any competitive event is difficult. And in team sports, you may be on the bench or you may be in the game, and you can't tell ahead of time. So my general recommendation is just to bolus afterwards as needed. And if you do short anaerobic events like a sprint, then and your blood sugar always goes up, then you can bolus beforehand if you want to. It's kind of a tough thing to predict. In terms of glucose sources during exercise, it's important to understand where it's coming from. So during exercise, say up to maybe an hour, about 15% of the glucose actually comes out of the blood. The other 85% comes from local glycogen stores in the muscle, which is why they're so important, and some from liver production of glucose. So under ideal circumstances, only about 15% of the carbohydrate is going to be coming out of your blood. So you don't generally need to eat a lot for in this kind of a setting. But what happens is this large drop in the glycogen stores then has to be replaced. So later in the hours that follow, you've got to make up for that excess the drop in the glycogen stores with carb intake or insulin reductions. Now in diabetes, one of the things you like to do is to rebuild glycogen fast. There are limits to how much glycogen rebuilding you can do right after an exercise, but there's a couple of windows. There's about a 20-minute window when you've got a real high sensitivity to insulin and the glycogen stores are looking for carbohydrate, and then the first 2 hours is kind of the most critical time period. That's when you can rebuild glycogen faster, and the advantage to that is that it reduces your risk of having later lows, like during the night. So getting this glycogen in is really critical. Most people use about 1 gram of carb and about 1/4 gram of protein per pound of body weight for the glycogen rebuilding. And you can't take all of that at one time. We're talking, for a 160-pound individual, we're talking 160 grams of carbohydrate. And the glycogen stores can't absorb it at that fast a rate. There are limits. So it's better to spread this out over time, but try to get maybe try to get about half of this in during the first 2 hours. Might be a good option. And it will require some insulin at those kind of quantities. So it's just a matter of kind of experimenting and seeing if you can reload quickly. Use fast carbs too. It's better. So I'm going to go through the bolus calculator a little bit. The bolus calculator on a pump is a huge advantage because you can see where you're at and kind of make predictions based on normal uses. So the settings in a pump are real simple. Basal rates are for safe sleep, usually about half of the total daily dose. The insulin-to-carb ratio, the carb factor, is to cover carbs well. The correction factor is to come down from a high blood sugar to normal without going low. The target glucose is to have a defined target to aim for with the pump. And the duration of insulin action, its role is to minimize insulin stacking. Is that a hand? Okay. So as this is just an example of somebody weighing about 160 pounds who's in relatively good control, and before their training, they might use like 40 units of insulin a day. That's a relatively normal insulin use for somebody who's not exercising. If they really get into an advanced training program, they may drop to 30 units during that time. Now, as they do that, it's important to kind of realize that all the settings need to change. You don't just use temp basal reductions to handle this kind of a situation where you drop a quarter of your insulin per day. So when they go from 40 to 30 units, the basal rate that they need drops from about 0.8 per hour down to 0.6. The carb factor will go up from 10.4 up to 13.6. The correction factor changes from 49 up to 65. And their insulin sensitivity, which you can measure with this kind of a setup, goes from about normal, 100%, up to about 125% with the activity. So the key is you don't change one setting for training. You change everything. They go in synchronicity with each other. Mm-hmm. Any questions?
It would be nice if there was a general sensitivity factor that would affect everything.
What's that?
It would be nice if there was a general sensitivity factor that would affect all the settings. So my son, there might be days where he's, it's always too much, and then there might be days where it's always too much, too little.
Yeah.
Instead of doing, just basal.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. We don't need just temp basal reductions. This is one of the things I've advocated to pump companies is to have temporary insulin adjustments. In other words, to do this in synchrony all at the same time. When you lower the basal rate, at the same time you raise your carb factor and raise your correction factor in a proportional manner, so that everything stays in sync, because that's what the body needs. That's what the normal body would do.
T-Slim does that. T-Slim allows you to make all the setting changes simultaneously by switching the profiles.
Well, no, you can on the T-Slim you can make all the settings in one location, but what I'm talking about is making those changes automatic. In other words, if I want to have a 90% insulin, the basal goes down that percentage, the carb factor goes up that percentage, the correction factor goes up that percentage.
Instead of
everything.
trying to figure it out each setting.
Right. It's kind of nonsense to think of only temp basal reductions. When a woman has a period, it isn't just the basal rate you need to change; it's the everything. So, yeah. This is one of many ideas I've tried to give the pump companies, and they're slow learners.
But the doctors have to buy into it too, right?
Yeah.
You're about 10 years ahead of John.
Just 10?
As always.
Sorry.
As always.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, on the bolus calculator, the inputs are real simple. You put in the glucose and the grams of carbohydrate, and the bolus calculator gives you back a dose that should be appropriate. So, now I like Emily Bowler's, quick way to cover carbs. I love that. So when I did the actual pump practices study, I looked at all the how the pumps were being used, and in particular how they were being used by people who were successful. But one of the things that really popped out was that I took the pump settings out of the carb factor settings out of the pump and the correction factors, and this is what they look like. So if you think about physiology, that is not physiology. Far from it. This we use a thing called R squared to see how appropriate the values fit what you'd expect. And the R squared on this is 40%. Normally, we'd like to have 100%. So carb factors are less than half of them are based on are where they ought to be. This black line is kind of what you'd expect from a Gaussian distribution of carb factors. So we see that people love magic numbers. They love 5, they love 10, they love 15, they love 20. They hate 9. 9 is discriminated against. 11 they don't like. Oh, 16. Boy, they really don't like 16. So my advice to people is to use the formulas to derive the factors in the pump. That is the fastest way to do this. Always use formulas. And there's the formulas. So I took 132 pumps where they had great blood sugar control, and I looked at how they were using the insulin. So the basal rate was about 48%. So you can just take your TDD and multiply it by 0.02 and find out what the average basal should be. On the carb factor, it's weight-based, so it's 2.6 times weight divided by TDD. So we don't use the old 450-500 rule anymore. On the correction factor, it turned out to be 1960. I'd always used the 1800 rule, but now a 1900 or 2000 rule might be a better tool. Kind of keep in mind, though, that the correction factor is not based on the number that you use has to be related to the blood sugar that you've got. For instance, somebody who's got a high A1C, they've got a large deficit in their carb factor or their basal rates. So they need a lot more correction to compensate. So they might use a 1500 rule or maybe even a 1200 rule to increase the amount of corrections that they give for a high blood sugar. So on the other hand, somebody who's got really great control, really a lot of normal blood sugars, they're in target range a lot, they might use a rule number of like 2400 or 2600 because they don't need much correction. So the correction factor is not a set number. It depends on the A1C.
I'm confused about something. All of these things, like my correction factor, my basal rates, they change throughout the day.
And that
the doctor did a 72-hour CGM, hardwire CGM, before he ever put me on the pump.
Yeah, yeah. So he's talking about having a lot of different numbers throughout the day. I kind of don't believe in that. I think we're pretty steady people. Every once in a while you need a little more insulin at breakfast than at other times of the day. But in my experience, that hasn't been the case.
Unless you have the dawn phenomenon.
That can add a little bit to it, but generally you try to correct that with a dawn phenomenon with a basal rate during the night.
Yeah, I have that. Would he up the basal rate at night?
Yeah. Yeah, Cliff.
It doesn't interdaily vary.
Go ahead and stand up, Sam Cliff.
Interdaily insulin does not change nearly as much as well, as we like to come up with. Well, at lunchtime I really need to back it way down. I really need to bring it way back up in the morning.
Oh, it's on mine. It's a 10th of a setting.
Quite that sensitive.
Mine's like a 10th of a setting. It's not even significant.
A lot of the factors that we try to control for can be explained more by other things.
Yeah.
Stress, hydration, carb count, simple carb counting. I mean, you're off by just 10 carbs, and a lot of you get in a package that says it's X carbs. It's really hard to say that that's always the same.
Yeah, exactly right. There are a lot of variables. On a pump, one of the things that I think is kind of underappreciated is that there's a lot of stacking that goes on. Sometimes because the DIA is set too short. Other times because of the pump itself. There are a lot of factors in it. But most people I find don't need big changes in carb factor, correction factor, number of basal rates. It's a lot steadier than you think. Mm-hmm.
You said a comment. I seem to need less insulin overnight to correct.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I use one correction factor during the day and a slightly different one at night. Just slightly different.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So less basal rate and less correction at night. Both. Is your basal rate lower at night, Charlie?
Generally, no.
Okay.
It just picks up for the dawn phenomenon.
Okay.
It just increases a little bit for that.
Well,
Don't worry about the correction factor when I'm sleeping.
yeah, yeah. Well, overnight we're kind of in an age group where we mimic young children more. Young kids and older adults tend to need less insulin at night because we don't put out as many stress hormones. We generally don't worry about things as much, and we just need less insulin. And so there are variations like that, but it's something that you have to know about yourself that makes a difference. So there's also a nice pump settings tool at on the diabetesnet.com site. If you haven't used it, you might look at that. So one thing I like about the ping pump is that it gives you everything right up front. So the carb bolus here in this setting was 2.9. The blood sugar correction, it was a little high, it needed 1.2, but this person has 4.35 units of insulin on board, and yet all of today's pumps will recommend taking 2.9 units of insulin in that situation. All carbs are covered fully in pumps today, and they shouldn't be. If you think about this, if you had 4.3 units of bolus on board at night, would you really take another 2.9? A lot of people do, and a lot of people have nighttime lows because they haven't looked at the bolus on board. So pumps are now starting to really integrate the insulin on board much more directly. Tandem has it in their pump on a lot of pages. Animas has it right on the bolus calculation. On the current Medtronic, if you dial down 3 times, you can see it. On the new Medtronic Veo, the insulin on board is listed on the bolus page, so you know how much you've got. So it's something to really be concerned about. All right. Well, we're kind of getting. Well, let me cover one thing. On a pump, avoid a short DIA. Cliff kind of mentioned this, but generally I recommend 4.5 to up to 6 hours for the duration of insulin action, because that's how long today's insulins work. If you set it shorter, you tend to hide bolus insulin activity, and that can generate unexplained hypoglycemia. And then you adjust the wrong setting. The DIA really needs to be set appropriately. I've got a paper coming up about the DIA and explaining how in a current testing we're not actually measuring DIA. It's never been measured in a glucose infusion rate study. I won't go through it here, but but the DI is longer than you think. All right. Well, I'll take a few questions. Do we? I guess we don't have a panel discussion, but any questions? We want to get our snack in here.
You mentioned the SNAP's ability to perform some different types of calculations.
Yeah.
Can you go into that?
Yeah, what they did with the SNAP was they let the user or clinician select whether to give a bolus calculation based on current pumps, or whether to do it in the better Cosmo fashion of subtracting excess bolus on board away from carb boluses. Yeah, so like this bedtime event here, the SNAP would say don't take any. The old Cosmo pump was even better. It would say, oh, by the way, you need 43 grams of carbohydrate.
Nice.
Yeah. And that's a feature I'd like to see put back in pumps, because it was a real blessing for people to see, whoa, it's telling me I've got a blood sugar of 143 and it's telling me to take 16 grams of carbohydrate. Well, maybe I'll do that. You know, it really helps.
You mentioned the SNAP and the Super Bolus as well. Can you talk on that a little bit?
Yeah, they're talking about adding the Super Bolus, which is basically taking future basal insulin, putting in a temp basal reduction, and then taking that insulin and stacking it on your current bolus. So you get a bigger bolus, like if you have a high blood sugar or you have a low glycemic or high glycemic index food, you get more insulin up front, yet you don't get any more insulin over the length of over time.
That would be good when I eat cereal.
Yeah, good for pancakes, good for cold cereal.
Cold cereal.
Oh
It
yeah.
says 24, but my body doesn't act like 24.
No, it's that rocket I showed is cornflakes. You know, it's it's quick. Okay.
Thanks, John.
Okay.